Well, hello, everybody. I'm Larry Cooley, and I've got the pleasure with Johannes Linn of co-chairing this community of practice. I see many people that we know personally and some that we don't. For those of you we don't yet know personally, thanks so much for joining us, and please do get to know us as we get to know you better. As I think is apparent to those of you who've been involved in this for some time, we really intend this community to be exactly that, a community. And that only works when people participate in precisely that way. So this is more than an invitation. We're actually imploring you to participate as if you own this community, because you do. I'll just say a little bit about it by way of introducing both it and the session. And then I'm going to hand over to the rest of my team to try and talk about the things that you're really here to listen to. So first of all, for those of you who've not been around from day one was a little over 9 years ago. And it was when we decided that this was a kind of a lonely enterprise talking about scaling, but perhaps there were people out there who wanted to join the conversation. And lo and behold, we've now gone from 40 that first day to something over 4,000 now, all united by one single concept, which is that focusing on sustainable outcomes at scale is something that we can contribute to the development enterprise and to the climate change effort, and that's badly needed at this particular point in time. The community's been around for a long time. It's open, it's free, and it's encouraging for all of you to participate precisely because it depends on nothing but us. We don't do it, it doesn't happen. And so what we do each year, among other things, is to have an annual forum, this being the eighth of those annual forums. And at those annual forums, we try to look back over what we think we've been learning and try to push the envelope just a little bit more. In the case of this year, we've had 12 sessions with a total of something over 900 people participating in those sessions. Each one, at least as far as I'm concerned, has been very, very stimulating. I've learned a lot. I thought I knew a lot about scaling, but I now realize there's a lot left to learn. And we're going to try this morning to review some of the things that came out of that, and more generally, just sort of where we are on issues of scaling. We're then going to take a deeper dive into the community of practice itself and how we can help to advance that work and help to help ourselves be better practitioners of it along the way. I've got a perfect team for doing this today. You know many of us, but I'll introduce us briefly anyway. There's Isabel Guerrero, who's been here from day one, and who probably as much as anyone else has in her body and soul the spirit of scaling. She, after a long career at the World Bank, has been running an organization she established called Imago Global Grassroots, and it does nothing but trying to help serious organizations at the grassroots reach truly sometimes national, often even global scale. Isabel's also taught for a decade the course on scaling at the Harvard Kennedy School, and we had a pleasure in plenary number 2 to preview and present to you the book she and colleagues have just written called Scaling Development Impact. Johannes doesn't need any introduction at all, because if you know me, you know him. But he and I have been finishing each other's sentences now for about 10 years on this issue of scaling, and it's been a real pleasure doing this together with him. Johannes, too, had a long career at the World Bank, but followed by a stint at the Brookings Institution running something called the Wolfenson Institute, which was once again dedicated to this proposition of scaling back before scaling was cool. And I'm Larry Cooley. I spent quite some years running a company called Management Systems International. I discovered this issue of scaling about 20 years ago and had a pleasure riding that horse ever since. And we're joined, I hope by now, by Alyssa Mioleni, who is a senior reporter at DevX. DevX, as some of you know, is the media sponsor for the community of practice, and we're very grateful to them for that. And Alyssa's coming on for at least the first part of our meeting to have a conversation with Isabel, Johannes, and myself about some of the major issues in scaling. In the course of doing that, we'll try to give you a little bit of a flavor for things we took away from the 11 sessions that have preceded this one this year. And we hope that you'll join in that conversation in the chat. I'll mention just a couple of things before I hand over to Alyssa. That is that if any of you would prefer to listen in a language other than English, you can do that in French or Spanish by going to those three little dots up top that say more and go down to interpretation and then choose the language that you wish. Or if some of you are people who like to see things written at the same time you hear them spoken, we'll be speaking in English, but you can also get closed captions in English going to that same place. The session will be recorded, and those recordings will be available along with everything else on the Scaling Community of Practice website, which if you registered for this, you probably already know by heart, but it's www.scalingcommunityofpractice.com. So without going further, let me invite Alyssa to come on screen and hand over to her. Thanks, Alyssa, for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, or wherever in the world you all are. Good afternoon, good evening. It's so great to be here. I've had such fun, frankly, just tuning into the various sessions and hearing about all the incredible work with scaling that you all are doing. But I want to, turn the microphone over to Larry and Johannes and Isabel, because the three of you collectively have about 60 years of experience in scaling behind you. So tell me, I'm going to ask, each of you to kind of take the mic for a moment. Do you think that there's been enough progress in this area? Do you think it's been enough? And if you can, would be great to kind of draw on some of the things that you've heard over the last 2 weeks and the incredible partner experiences that have been shared. But yeah, tell us, what do you think has been the progress so far?
Well, I drew the straw that lets me go first on this, so I'm going to do that. Just to say that if I thought it was enough, we'd retire from this now. But I think there's a lot of work left to be done, but not to diminish the fact that I think where we are now is miles ahead of where we started. I mean, genuinely miles. I'm not saying that to be polite. It's really what I think. And if you tuned into any number of the sessions this week, you couldn't but be impressed at how we've gone from what I think at the beginning, looking back on it, was a little bit of finger wagging, where we were kind of chastising the community for what it wasn't doing, which I think is still appropriate, but it's now joined with very practical things that people either are doing or can do. I'm going to give you a couple of the ones that stood out for me where I think important progress has been made, although I would underline in each one of the things I'm going to mention, I think there's still a ways to go. So the one that jumped out to me this year, more than in previous years, were the conversations about sustainable sources of finance. I really think we've talked about that. We've paid lip service to it over the years, but I think we really are getting our hands around what it takes to try and do something that's not simply there as long as donors are willing to fund it, but there in some fundamental, sustainable way. We use the distinction between transactional and transformational scaling, which I think is a super rich concept, but it in significant part, focuses on this notion of having a stable, continual, dependable way of doing whatever it is for people at scale, but over time. And that means integrating it into real national systems, whether they be market or government or social enterprise systems. That, to me, we've gone a really substantial distance, notwithstanding the distance we have left to go. Second thing I would point out is I think we've really gotten much more sophisticated about the role of government. When I say government, I mean the governments of the countries where the programs are taking place. And I think, again, we talked about that from the beginning, but if I compare now to then, the thing that really stands out to me is I think we sometimes mistook what I would call government concurrence for government ownership. The government would go along with things, the government would bless them, but if they didn't really own them. And recognizing what a big step there is between concurrence and ownership, and what it really takes for a government to own something, for it really to be theirs, and what that implies about the role of the rest of us as third parties, trying to help to make that happen or support them in that effort, I think is a real sophistication step in our own thinking about what we're involved in. And I guess the other thing that I would mention is that I think we've gotten much more realistic about the time frame and the flexibility that's necessary for things to go to scale. The challenges are enormous for traditional donors to catch up to those realities, but it's not because we don't understand it. And we really understand now that this is typically about a 15-year process, and that there are lots and lots and lots of unpredictable junctures and turns along the way. And the idea of a fixed project with fixed duration after which the job is done is simply not consistent with our own observations about what scaling involves. And now everybody, I think, in one way or another, is trying to run to catch up to that reality because practice hasn't yet reflected that. But to me, our understanding and the number of examples of people who have caught up to that is a real source of light. So no, I think in terms of have we gone as far as we need to on any of those things, plus any number of other things, I would say no. But we'd be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't credit a lot of the progress that's been made. Johannes or Isabel?
Isabel, do you want to go ahead?
Happy to. So I was going a bit further back to answer your question because I just had to do some research on this book that I just wrote. In the World Bank, we had this amazing president that worked very closely with Johannes Wolfenson. And I remember we had a 2003 Scaling Up event in Shanghai about how to scale up the fight against poverty. And if I think from there, and then what has happened to now, at that point, we were basically focused on best practices. Lots of examples of best practices, and we thought that that would be enough to be able to then scale the impact in terms of poverty. And then came all the work that Johannes, Larry, Ruth did over time, and then the MDGs and the SDGs, which really brought the focus on the scale of the problem. But I feel that there was a lot of incubation of different ways of thinking, but not a lot of traction in terms of the number of people who were wearing or thinking about scale. And I feel that the community of practice over the last 10 years have really helped. Maybe it's helped us see, or it has helped tap into this organic growth over time of a common understanding of scaling. And so I think that there's a broad understanding today about things that were very far from being a common understanding not that many years ago. There's a broad understanding on the fact that scaling up is a transformation, that scaling up is not just having best practices and then getting people to know about them. It's about adaptation, iteration, and finding specific methodologies, either to scale up in conflict areas, or how to prepare for scale, how to define scale, and then how to measure scale. And so I think there's a momentum that has been building. This is what I feel. Of course, it's not enough. And I think the big next step is what Johannes and Richard are working on in terms of thinking about how to mainstream it in the funding world, connected to what Larry was saying. That is the next the next step, but the momentum has definitely been building, and the way of thinking has been changing in some fundamental ways that are really important for scaling.
Right. Lisa, should I just continue? Because it picks up quite naturally from where Isabel ended. So Isabel mentioned our initiative on mainstreaming scaling in funder organizations. And actually, in terms of noting the progress, I wanted to pick up from there because, I've been working now since I left the World Bank in 2003, I've been working with funder organizations trying to help them focus on scaling. And frankly, it's been an uphill battle. And until we started this project and we reached out, I never thought that we'd really made a lot of progress in terms of getting funder organizations to take the scaling agenda seriously and systematically pursue it. But lo and behold, when we started reaching out last spring to various funder organization friends and colleagues, we actually found some 25 organizations that responded right away. And out of the 25, we managed to actually get case studies for 12. And among those case studies, roughly half turned out to be organizations that already had integrated scaling fairly significantly and centrally in their organizational approach to development finance. And I thought that, looking back now, actually, I'm really still surprised that this so much was going on, so much interest was there. Now, that in itself, I thought was interesting and encouraging. And actually, most recently, I had an opportunity in working with a global financing facility for every woman, every child to interview a number of government officials to see what their view was on what the GFF, so-called, what it's trying to do in its scaling efforts. GFF is one of the funder organizations that actually tries systematically to support scaling. And I found every single government official said, we need, yes, scaling is important. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And we need the kind of support that GFF is offering us. So it isn't just the funder community. I think it's also a great demand out there. And actually IDRC, I now remember IDRC did a very interesting exercise. IDRC is the Canadian bilateral research funding organization with recipients of its own funding, and found that they too felt very strongly that scaling had to be really pushed very hard. And of course, Isabel, you're working with social enterprise. So I actually think we're kind of riding a wave. Surfing is perhaps the best comparison, Larry, that I feel we're doing at this juncture. And it's very exciting and it's terrific. Now, is it enough? No, it isn't, because too many, and I'm especially in the funder organization world, still don't do it systematically enough. And while they talk quite a bit about scaling, and that's terrific, by the way, including Ajay Banga at the World Bank now, the new president, IDB, its new strategy is transforming for scale and impact. Hey, that's terrific. So while we're talking still now a lot, many, particularly bigger funder organizations, haven't yet been able to actually integrate scaling into their day-to-day, on the ground, in the frontline practices. And that's where I think the big challenge is. Let me stop here.
Yeah, I think, Johannes, that you've actually teed us up really, really nicely for what was my next question. But I do just want to echo a couple of things that I heard. And I think Rita in the chat put it really nicely. It's like the momentum and awareness is built, it seems like, and that seems like the foundational step, right? And it's governments are kind of understanding this, Larry talked about this longer time scale. So this is exciting, right? But as I think each speaker mentioned, it might not be enough, or it's not enough. And Johannes used the word systematically. So I want to drive in on that a little bit more. And I have questions for each of you, so bear with me. We'll go through one by one. But just on terms of what can be done to make sure that scaling actually happens in a systematic and comprehensive way. So let's turn back over to Larry first. Given your perspective as the manager of a successful consulting firm, and in recent years an advisor actually to a lot of implementers and funders, what do you think can be done to make sure that this scaling does happen in a systematic and comprehensive way?
I've got a lot of confidence in governments driving this, the recipient governments, because when you think about what the reality looks like on the ground, they're responsible for delivering population level results. They ought not to, and they typically don't think in terms of projects. Donors are organized in terms of projects. And so if you put yourself in the position of a forward-leaning government official, and you say, what are you trying to do? You're trying to use the donor money to try and change something permanently in some systematic way on the ground. And in a way, the funding system becomes your constraint. It's as much as it is your enabler on that. And so I think one thing that's hopeful as far as I'm concerned is trying to get the recipient countries to really genuinely see this as simply the delivery of goods and services to their population to meet needs on the ground that are real and that are not by their nature projectized. Projects are a way to get there. The other thing I think is important, and both Isabel and Johannes can probably speak to this more firsthand than I, is I think the incentives in the funder organizations are a major issue. Because if you think, what do people get rewarded for? It's so focused on projects and trying to achieve the proximate outcomes of the project, not the long-term changes in the country. We don't even tend to have systems for continuing to track that. We're really looking at what happens during the project period to project participants and beneficiaries. And I think that's not necessarily a complete contradiction to scaling, but it sets up some barriers to scaling. So trying to figure out ways to break down those obstacles seems to me another place. I'll say just one more, and then I'm really interested in what Isabella and Johannes have to say about this. I think we've undervalued the role of foundations in this thing because for exactly the reason that we were saying before, it takes a lot of flexibility. It takes a willingness to stay over a long period of time. It sometimes takes the ability to intervene on things that don't show direct people level impacts. They're in the system. You're trying to help improve the system. Well, that's hard for the official donors to do. So one of the things I've taken away from this is there's a much larger role than currently played, I believe, for private foundations. Not because they're the large money in this, but because they have at least the possibility of a flexibility that the official donors find it more difficult to adopt.
Thanks, Larry. I think now we'll turn it over to Isabel, if that's okay. So really kind of looking at your perspective, we're talking to now everyone, a former World Bank practitioner, a social entrepreneur and advisor, and, teaches and writes about scaling at Harvard. So tell me, Isabel, from your perspective in all those many hats, what's the problem and the solution? What can we do?
So the problem is, I think, we need a mental shift from experts thinking that we know the solution and that either there's one innovation that is going to solve a problem or that we have the answers, to really realizing first, there are no magic bullets in this business. And second, that development practitioners really need to get out of their comfort zone. And work with the human beings or the communities that we want to serve in defining what is that intervention that needs to scale. I think I've learned a lot this from both Johannes and Larry, the importance that innovation is not one thing, but it's a whole process. And in that implementation is where the magic of scaling needs to happen. And so going with an expert hat that you think that there's a one-point solution is not going to get you to succeed in scaling. But the whole incentive system, as Larry was saying, is for us to, in large organizations, not to ask difficult questions, not to shake things too much, appear as if you absolutely know the answers. And so that mental shift is a really difficult one. And that's why I think social enterprises are such an amazing tool, because you are outside of a system, you're not constrained by the need to get everything right every time, that you can fail quickly, you can be nimble, and you can eventually find not only innovations, but interventions that have a whole process of implementations that eventually can be taken to scale. So I think that mindset shift is the most difficult one, but the most important.
Yeah, and Johannes, I mean, you work with development funders, right? You have for many years, and a lot of the things that Isabel has just mentioned, whether it's longer time frame or accepting failure, that doesn't look great for a donor report, right? So, are donors and funders really kind of starting to do a better job in supporting scaling, or what do you think is stopping them from doing that? Is it what Isabel has just mentioned? Are there other things that you've kind of heard and seen in your work with these funders? And I guess just to make it not all negative, do you think there are ways that they can turn it around, at least that perspective and mind shift?
Right. Yeah, no, I there are a lot of issues, but there are also, I think, opportunities. But let me start perhaps with the issues. And again, I'm kind of focusing here on the funders. And let's not forget, as Larry pointed out, that, and Isabel, that we actually have lots of actors out there that we should and will eventually focus on. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the session, the second segment. But let me stick with the funders for now. And, some of the issues we discussed in the first session, so I very briefly summarize. So yeah, I mean, the problem with funders, as Larry indicated, in contrast to governments, they're kind of stuck in the one-off project modality. And, very few funding projects are actually designed from the beginning to think about and design for what happens when the project ends. They're all designed to focus on delivering the project, quote unquote, delivering the usually narrowly defined project results according to some project plan that you have to adhere to pretty much, rigidly. And then the project ends and, you move on. I mean, I remember a case where Jim Wolfenson, my then boss, so when I was at the World Bank, he came back from Georgia and said, Johannes, we had this great I saw this great rural credit project. We supported 5,000 farmers. I asked the country director, what about, how many farmers are there that could be helped? 50,000, she said. Well, in the end, it turns out the World Bank didn't follow up because we had other projects we had to do. So this one-off nature, without thinking what happens when the project ends, who takes over, preparing the ground, preparing the platform for subsequent scaling, and by the way, sustainability, very importantly, means that many of our initiatives basically are pilots to nowhere. And indeed, this whole piloting philosophy that's very widespread in the donor community without follow-up, systematic follow-up thereafter, is really at the core of the problem, together with the inflexibility of implementation, which basically means, as Isabel and Larry indicate, you have to, if you want to scale, you have to learn as you go, and you have to adapt as you go. And the traditional project model doesn't allow that. In the end, it is also, as Larry indicated, sort of what we call the transactional focus. The idea is you do a project, and the bigger the project, the bigger the impact. Yeah, that's true. But in terms of long-term sustainable impact and reaching the scale that you need to reach, you have to do transformational scaling. The one-off bigger scale, yes, is helpful, but it won't solve your problem. So the symptoms are pilots to nowhere. The symptoms are the denominator problem, as we call it. You basically measure your contribution in terms of against the baseline. We've helped 10,000 or so people get out of poverty. Yeah, but what is the poverty problem, and how far do you have to go, and what do you have to do beyond the 10,000 is really where the focus has to be. Let me flag a couple other problems that I think are really important that we've learned from our work right now. One is that the frontline teams are simply overloaded with too many mandates and too many expectations that are being loaded on the traditional objectives of delivering, yes, a project, because you now have environmental issues, you have climate change issues, you have gender issues. All of these are unfunded, often unfunded mandates. In other words, project teams have to deliver on these mandates, but they're not given additional money or resources to actually do it. And now we come as a scale up, as we say, hey, yeah, while you're at it, why don't you do some scaling too? And they say, you must be kidding me. We can't do this on top of everything else we're already told to do as unfunded mandates. So that is a real constraint, and more realism in terms of the project mandate, simpler projects ultimately, and scaling as a mandate that cuts across all other mandates is really where I think the answer is. So finally, what's the answer? Well, leadership is critical. If you don't have the leaders at the top saying scaling matters, it's not going to happen, because it has to be systematic throughout the organization. Secondly, Larry mentioned incentives for the frontline staff. If the staff doesn't have the incentives and the resources, it will not happen. And finally, you have to focus on ownership by countries and working with partners, because it's only if you work with, through, and in support of the local constituencies, communities, governments, stakeholders, and with partners are you going to succeed on scaling. Thank you.
Yeah, listen, I want to, besides agreeing with every word that Johannes just said, I want to add something that we sometimes talk about. It's a smallish detail compared to some of those big things, but it's a place I think a big inroad could be made, and that's around the way we evaluate success.
Right.
If you look at the evaluation systems that not just donors but now countries also use, it really does not capture some things it easily could, that would focus on whether we're making progress towards success, not just in terms of the ultimate results, what Johannes is calling the denominator, but also in terms of really making the systemic changes that would allow those things to continue happening over time. And it's proven to be frustratingly difficult to get those evaluation systems changed. But I don't see why there needs to be, or even should be, the obstacles that currently exist to doing that. Places that seem to me relatively low-hanging fruit that we could make a change that would help to drive the other changes, that one jumps out at me.
Yeah, I just wanted to connect what Larry said to what Louis Borstein said in the chat, who's hit the nail in the head. And I want to ask you, Johannes, what you think about that. So the definition of success, is success a project or a development outcome? And of course, if you are in the World Bank, you say it's a development outcome. Yet, we were sort of hardwired for projects. So why do you think that happens, Johannes, and in what way the mainstreaming of scaling up could deal with that disconnect that Luis is pointing in the chat?
Yeah, well, I actually think, the definition of success has to include creating the conditions for continued and sustained scaling if the project and the intervention works. Obviously, if it doesn't work, well, you declare victory or failure, whatever. And by the way, that's not a bad story either. I mean, we're learning from our failures. And frankly, the many funders cannot accept that they fail, which then drives them to actually, throw in the kitchen sink and try to make the project succeed, which makes it non-replicable, non-scalable, almost by definition. So I think defining project success shouldn't be just in terms of we've reached X number of people or we've provide X number of health gadgets or whatever. It should be we've created the platform that allows a well-defined group, institution, whoever, to actually take what we supported with our funding, to take this forward with a reasonable degree of certainty and with a clear expectation that it isn't just going to be left out there with magical thinking that somebody will pick it up, but actually we have created the conditions for continuation of what was started under the project. That to me is the definition of success, ultimately, from a sustainable scaling perspective.
Yeah, so we've got, kind of the expectation and mindset change. We've got getting donors on board for what might be a longer term project. There's a number of different things that it seems like actually it's really important to do at the get-go, right? Before a project even begins or starts.
Right.
Now, Isabel, you've been teaching scaling for quite a number of years at Harvard. And I'm just curious, when we're looking at, the next leaders of these programs going forward into the future, I mean, what type of reaction are your students having to this type of instruction? And do you have a sense that they're going to take this forward? Is there a chance that the next generation of development practitioners might take more scaling practices and these things we're talking about, whether it's mindset shift or, kind of how we define success going forward?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I just started teaching, and first of all, the students that I get are very diverse. I have 50 students, and they come from the Graduate School of Education, from the Graduate School of Health, from the Graduate School of Design, from the Kennedy School and Economics, from MIT. So very diverse backgrounds, very diverse experience from the private sector, social entrepreneurs, public sector, academia. And so that diversity of interest for me is a very hopeful sign that from many points of view, people are thinking about the importance of scale. The second thing I've been shocked, and maybe it's because it's only my second week, COVID has had a real impact in the frame of mind of students. You see that students really do not believe that the development, the way of thinking about development is providing the answers that are needed for this world today. With all the multiple crises that we have in terms of both climate change, conflict, migration, and all that. And so I see students very open to the idea of thinking differently, of thinking about transformation, of being very much, we did norms together, of being very much against cancel culture, of challenging each other. So in terms of fertile ground, I see a big shift this year from other years. I've been teaching for 10 years in the frame of mind of the students, much more exploring, much more looking together to find something new, to create something new, where we give just the framework, and then they can play and act together from different disciplines and find solutions going forward. So it's a really interesting, a bit unsettling moment, but that's where I see it.
Great, perfect. Turning over back to Johannes and Larry. So looking at kind of being a part of the last 2 weeks and seeing what scaling community of practice has grown to be over the last 9 years, you've kind of engaged in a scaling practice of your own, right? In terms of growing the community. So kind of thinking about that process, I would love to just know if what you see as the key constraints for the community itself as it continues to grow. And how will you know whether you have succeeded? What are the definitions of success for you both? And my last question in that set of questions is, any lessons from this experience that maybe others can use?
Shall I start, Larry? Okay. So as I was thinking about actually sort of, looking back over the last 9, we're now in our 10th year, I have to say I've become a lot more modest in terms of my expectations about, how easy or difficult it is to actually scale when you're in the middle of the process. Because as you indicated, Alyssa, it is a scaling process that we're trying to sort of, promote here by creating and then growing this, and now trying to make it sustainable. And we'll talk about that more this afternoon. First of all, it takes a long time, I mean, I've been working on the scaling business basically for the last 20 years and for the last almost 10 years now as part of this community practice. And it really, patience, because there's so many times we think it's just not going to happen. And then all of a sudden you have, some forward progress, some exciting moment. And so the other related thing is, try and start young. I mean, I started this process 20 years ago and I was already not that young anymore, but start young because it's going to take a long time. And before you know it, you think, hey, maybe it's time for me to have to pass on the baton because for various reasons, not least because of maybe time and age. But okay, so that's sort of the general problem. Now, specific challenges. The valley of death is real. I mean, for those of you who've been in the innovation diffusion literature, the valley of death and we experience it as a risk, as a challenge almost every day, Larry, right? I mean, it's a reality. Finance, chicken and egg problem. If you don't have a good to sell, you're not going to get people to buy it. And so you have to put yourself out there with something to sell that's credible if you want to get funding. But on the other hand, you can't really create the product necessarily at the scale that makes it credible if you don't have sort of a good amount of core funding. Founder syndrome. I mean, we face it now, as you'll hear later. Larry and I are hoping to step back sooner or later. Well, what is going to happen when the founders leave? Creating the tension, creating the substance of the work that you're in the business of doing on the one hand, and actually selling your organization to the world. I mean, the creation, the substance of the work takes a certain skill. The selling what you're trying to sell and as an idea and disseminate and whatever it takes another skill. And also the conflict in terms of there's a tension in terms of the limited time you have to do both. So that tension between doing the substance and actually selling, if you wish, your idea to the wider world is something that I struggle with every day. So then there's the volunteer model. We have this volunteer model, and we'll talk more about it later. It has its natural limitations, and what it drives us to, I think, is we have to define a credible business model, and that's still a struggle that we have. Business model in the sense that it is sustainable over time. And finally, ultimately, I think, and I'm learning to deal with this, I think you have to let go of the idea of growing the organization as the principal objective, and you really have to focus on growing the idea and its impact more generally. You have to be willing to hand off, and you have to be willing to let go in the best possible way. It's sort of like, getting back to this idea of project. You really have to think not just about doing the project, you have to think about how do you hand off to others when it's time to move on. So let me stop here.
I could say just amend and quit there, but I'll add on two more little pieces. One is there's a model that Isabel and I developed some years ago that I think applies to the community of practice just as it does to scaling. And that is, if you think about 3 different sets of actors, the people who are doing innovations, the people who are delivering goods and services, There's a third group, which are people who are doing intermediation between those two, that are they're not coming up with what should be done. They're not delivering it. They're helping those two things find each other. And that tends to be an unsung and undervalued function in our world. And I would say that's the entirety of what this community of practice is doing. It's not promoting particular things to be scaled, it's promoting scaling. It's not promoting a particular configuration, for example, or a coalition. It's trying to promote coalitions. It's trying to do the things that make the rest of it possible, but it is neither the innovation itself nor the delivery to people on this. That's, in the private sector, a pretty easy function to fund. That's basically investment banking, venture capital, things of that sort. There's no good equivalent in our world. And so we're doing something that is, I think you get heads nodding up and down for the importance of, but you don't get wallets opening up, because it's much easier to go to market with asking for funding for an innovation or funding for delivery, and not for this system building, field building kind of work that we do. It's a good thing we're not trying to grow the organization, because I don't think it would work. It only worked because we weren't trying to grow it. It grew because we weren't trying to grow it. It grew because we were really promoting an idea and didn't overown the idea. But if our job had been raising money for a community of practice, I think we would have had challenges of an enormous size, just the same way these intermediaries do in scaling particular interventions. So I'm really, I mean, this is perhaps immodest to say, but I'm really proud of what's happened. I mean, I would never have imagined it when we started this 10 years ago. Wasn't at all clear anyone was going to want to participate at all. And I think now, not so much thanks to us as thanks to the changing times, we caught a wave on this, and it's been enormously fun to ride it. But I think it needs to be coupled with the kinds of realities that Isabel and Johannes were talking about. Essentially, governments and markets have incentives to grow. Intermediaries don't in our world. And so the kind of thing that we are needs to really work hard to find a niche and people who are willing to support it in some way, including voluntarily.
And if we could tie to what Johannes is doing with the funders, I think funders could be intermediaries too. I'm thinking of the IDB lab. I'm thinking of the UNDP lab.
Right.
There's an intermediation function for those labs to help bring the innovations to a point where then they can be scaled by the mainstream. That's
actually a theme of our funder mainstreaming work. Thanks, thanks, Isabel. Yeah. Alyssa, do you want to close with any sort of this first segment of this particular session, with any closing comment before I thank you for your help and for you being with us? But by the way, of course, you're welcome to stay on. But what is your takeaway, if any, at this stage?
Goodness, I mean, I think my big takeaway, not just with this session, but the sessions that came before it, is there's so much that's happening. And there's still so much work to do, right? So we're in this kind of exciting yet somewhat scary state in terms of this community of just how much work we have left to go, but also we have a lot of success to build on, right, as a community.
Right.
And in terms of that, and that's really exciting. I think thinking toward the future, and kind of a couple of things that Isabel had mentioned with her students, and just like whether this perspective and mindset will shift. We've got donors who are kind of understanding, okay, longer term. We have partner organizations that are trying to think or starting to think differently. So that's all really exciting. And I think if anyone's not following the chat, I think there's also a really interesting extra conversation going on in the chat where folks are just, talking about how different, whether it be funding at the systems level, I see as one comment, or we've got kind of a discussion on localization happening, and localization versus scaling. And I think that's another really interesting thing too. So I look forward to continuing to see how this community tackles those questions, and continues to kind of work with the concept of scaling and with one another to take things forward. So let me thank the three of you for your incredible insights, and thank you for letting DevX and me be a part of the conversation.
No, thank you, Alyssa. It's been great to have you. Thank you for your Very good questions, which touched off a lot of comment from my colleagues. By the way, Isabel, thank you for joining us. I know you have to run off to your class, so by any time you bow out, just wave at us, and we'll know that you're doing.
I'll take the opportunity now to leave. It gives me a little bit of time to run. Thank
All
you
right.
to both of you for having me. This was great, and
Thanks for
really
joining us.
congratulations for the community of practice. It's amazing.
Well, you've been a key pillar, my dear, so you can't get away too easily. But let me come back to Alyssa, because I'm not sure, Larry, whether you mentioned at the outset that actually we have, and Laura, you in the chat, you asked, could DevX hopefully join the COP? Well, actually DevX has joined the COP in the sense that we now have a media partnership with DevX, which we're very excited about and very happy about. And Alyssa's participation here is one of the signs of this. We also, by the way, in the newsletters that DevX put out, we're very grateful that DevX advertised the forum. So we're very excited about this this mutual support here, because it's actually in the spirit, I guess, of volunteer. We are, in a sense, advertising the good work that DevX is doing, because I think a lot of wonderful stuff comes out of DevX. To be really, let me take this opportunity to advertise a little bit on your behalf, Alyssa, and your boss's behalf, whom I have known for the last 20 years, actually, since you founded DevX. Raj Kumar has done an amazing job by talking about scaling up. At some point, we should do a case study of DevX scaling, because it's really quite a scaling story. Anyway, so we actually have this partnership as one of pro bono, where we both, I think, are able to help each other. And it's actually in the spirit of, I think, the community of practice that this is happening. So I thank you, Alyssa, for today's wonderful moderation. And I thank Raj Kumar and his team and his entire team for teaming up with us. So this is wonderful. Thanks very much. Please, Isabel, bye-bye. Thank you for joining us. And Alyssa, if you want to stay, by all means, stay for the second half. And we look forward to cooperating with you and your colleagues in the future. So with this, we're a few minutes behind, but I think that's just fine, because we already started, in a sense, talking about the main topic for the second segment of this 90 minutes session, the closing session of our forum. And maybe Gabi, thank you very much. By the way, while I have you, Gabi, your attention, I want to thank you and your team at MSI, in case we forget later on, for all the amazing work you guys have done in the logistics, setting up the Teams platform. I know there are times when it got a little difficult, but that is just you've done a wonderful job over the last 12 sessions. So thank you so much, you and Jackie and Ellie. So thanks for your terrific support. Anyway, here's the agenda for the second segment of today's session. We'll give you a little bit of background on the mission of the Scaling Community Practice. Incidentally, we decided to change our acronym from COP to SCOP, or Scaling Community Practice, to be a bit more indicative of what we're all about. So I hope you don't mind. I will then, Larry will start on the background and mission. I will then say a few words about what we have tentatively identified as a 10-year agenda. I guess a vision. One of the things about scaling, you have to have a vision, otherwise you don't know where the heck you're heading. So our 10-year agenda or vision. We have a list of, again, tentative list of substantive issues that we might want to explore in 2024 and 2025, based in part on our conversations in the forum. And then really quite significant sort of thoughts on organizational options going forward that Larry will close with. And then, frankly, I hope you will continue with your interventions in the chat throughout the next 40 or so minutes. But if you also at some point want to raise your hand and intervene with sight and sound, by all means, raise your hand and we'll try and call on you. We're hoping to make this an interactive session as best as we can, given the numbers. We still have about 50 of us on the call, which, by the way, is a great number. So with this, let me hand over to Larry to start us on this with background and mission of the community of practice. Larry.
Okay, well, I'll do this quickly because I think many of you are familiar with some of these points, but I want to make sure we all start on the same page. And I'll begin with the whole concept of this being a community of practice. For the first, I would say 6 or 7 years, it was exclusively focused on the first two goals, peer learning and field building. We basically saw ourselves as practitioners or scholars around scaling. Our major objective was to help each other, to try and build together some common understanding of what we were trying to do, how we were trying to do it. In the last year or so, and increasingly going forward, as you listen to Johannes in a minute about the 10-year vision, we've taken on what you might call an advocacy agenda and done this very unapologetically. We're not advocating for one sector or another, for one intervention or another. We're advocating for a systematic approach to scaling. And we see ourselves now as a community as having a mission to try and change the way development is done. It's pretty, in a way, it's a bit grandiose, but I don't think it's incorrect to characterize our intentions. The model's got several features, and it has had from the beginning. It's volunteer-based. At the beginning, it was a 100% volunteer-based, not a dollar changed hands. Now it's still primarily volunteer-based. It's free and open. Anyone who wants to join is not only encouraged to, but entirely welcome. It's member-owned and run. We have a very broad executive committee now that basically proxies the membership, but whenever there's something anyone else wants, we pride ourselves in trying to be responsive to that. We decided at the outset, although we would have working groups that are sometimes sectoral or issue-based, that we'd really focus as much as we could on learnings and insights that cut across those. So it's deliberately cross-sectoral and it's deliberately global. I would say at the beginning, most of us resided in the global north. That's not true anymore, but still it remains a work in progress to make sure global is something we're delivering against, not only in terms of our substance, but in terms of our composition and our leadership. The activities are several. You're participating in the annual forum. We've done that from the beginning. This is the 8th. We have 10 working groups that we do newsletters. We're up to 29 of those. We do a number of knowledge products. We're going to talk about one of them in a little bit of depth today. And we operate a website and social media. Next, Gabby. So again, as I said, we're 9 years old. We're now 4,000 members, 400 organizations from 70 countries. 10 working groups. We've done 200 plus webinars, 29 newsletters, and we invented along the way this concept of funding partner, in part because, as Johannes alluded to before, there are some inherent limitations in the volunteer model. One is what you do if you don't happen to have post-retirement people like Johannes and myself. But a second is how you support the administrative functions of the organization. MSI has basically acted as a de facto fiscal sponsor because we're not a standalone organization as the community of practice. And that means that some of those services needed to be compensated as if it were a project for MSI. To do that, we basically created the concept borrowed from National Public Radio of sustaining members. And we've had a total of 15 people either in that capacity or, as I'll mention in a minute, as core funders. This year's forum, as you know, 12 sessions, 900 plus participants, and something we haven't mentioned, but I want to really brag on a little bit, which is that the speakers in those 12 sessions came from 52 different organizations of every size and shape, from 18 countries and 6 continents. Apologies to Antarctica. We'll try to do better next time. But just looking across this in comparison to where we were a few years ago, this is a remarkable change and one I think we should be proud of. Next. So I'm not going to go through these at all, but just to show you, these were this year's 12 sessions. And the only reason I'm putting them up is I want you to see the breadth of this and the substance of the kinds of things that we covered. As you'll note, the first, the second, now this last one were plenary sessions. The other 9 were organized by one or the other of the 10 working groups. I participated in all but one that I couldn't somehow work out the scheduling on. They were wonderful. I mean, they were really substantive, nuanced, not self-serving, not showboating. I mean, really exploratory sessions. It's just what you'd want from a community of practice, in my opinion. So for me, looking at where we are and where we're trying to go, there's a lot of pride to be taken in where we started to where we are, but there's a big challenge ahead, and that's what I'm going to hand over to Johannes to try to outline.
Thanks. So, you know, some of you are probably aware that we had a strategy that we formulated in 2022, early 23, for the 3-year period, 2023 to 2025. And that strategy is actually on our website. You can review it. Had sort of various components that were fairly concrete in terms of defining where we wanted to go, both in terms of the nature of the community practice, in terms of the areas where we thought we could and should be active, but also in terms of the organizational format of the community practice, where we thought over the 3-year period we could move from this very informal community practice that we currently and had until then to a more formal not-for-profit structure that would then be sustainable as a freestanding organization into the future and could perhaps grow and maybe also develop its own business model and so on for sustainability and including financing. Now, as we tried to implement this strategy over the last year and a half, we realized that we actually need 2 things. We needed a longer-term vision. It wasn't good enough to just have the sort of the 2-3-year vision or plan or strategy that we'd formulated. And so what I'm going to talk about for the next 3 slides is briefly sort of a vision that Larry and I and colleagues in the community practice and the executive committee developed to guide us, yes, now in this year, next year, in sort of trying to transform also organizationally, and we'll come to that after we lay out the vision, organizationally, what the community practice might look like. Just to give you an advanced warning here, we concluded that setting up a freestanding 501c3, as it's called in the United States, not-for-profit formal organization is not likely to be feasible given various constraints, which we can talk about if you're interested in the Q&A portion. But instead, we probably are looking for a host organization. But in order to fold, if you wish, the community practice into. But in order to do that, we felt we needed to have and go into any discussions with a potential host organization with a sort of, so what is the potential contribution which a community practice like ours could make so that we can define and, by the way, co-create ultimately with a potential host organization what the future might look like. So with this as background, let me briefly share with you over the next 2 slides what are the sort of the vision that we put forward tentatively and more as a potential rather than necessary is fixed in stone. In fact, nothing in this business is fixed in stone, as we know from scaling experience. So what is the potential vision, and what is, very broadly, what is the pathway towards achieving the vision? So let me briefly run you through this, remembering always that it is potential, it is tentative, and is subject to discussion and subject to amendment as one goes along. Now, the vision is, and this is a 10-year vision, don't forget, the vision is to reach a tipping point over the next 10 years where systematic approaches to achieving sustainable outcomes at scale become the default option for all development actors. So not just funders, not just government organizations, not just social enterprises, but across the board. The pathway towards that vision, we have very tentatively identified 3 steps over the next 3 years, next 10 years, with the first step continuing to focus on funder organizations in continuation of the work we are currently doing under our mainstreaming initiative for funder organizations. And so for the years 2023 to 2025, we actually, building on this ongoing work, we think there are a number of key outcomes which we can aim for. First of all, significant progress in actually mainstreaming scaling into at least 20 funder organizations. creation and dissemination of a widely accepted metric to track mainstreaming, which turns out to be important for subsequent steps. Mainstreaming scaling in OECD and MOPAN, development principles and evaluation practices. We've already been working with OECD DAC, and we had contacts with MOPAN and some interest in doing that. Indeed, OECD DAC is now developing scaling principles for its bilateral members, and we are helping OECD DAC in that regard. We also want to grow the scaling community practice to at least 5,000 members and importantly broadening its leadership, and we can come back to that. And finally, and it's not listed here, but we'll come to it in a minute, we want to do knowledge work in key emerging issues, which I'll discuss in a separate slide in a minute. So this is the step one. The next, by now it's a year and a half of total period of 2023 to 2025. We then think it would be appropriate and highly desirable in step two to expand the scope of the principal focus of the work by working with key stakeholders in developing countries, 25 to 28. And the key outcomes of this is that there's significant progress with mainstreaming of scaling in governments, private sector, and social enterprise in at least 10 countries, as measured by the tracking tools that we will have developed, as I mentioned earlier. We would continue mainstreaming of scaling in funder organizations, and we've listed 30 funders. Whether that's the right number, I don't know, but somewhere around there, basically making sure that funders really systematically take up the scaling and continue the take up of scaling. And we would continue to grow the scaling community practice. And the third step is mainstreaming scaling as a key element of the Global Development Goals and the Global Development Effectiveness Agenda 2028-2033. Now, this is an idea which is maybe very hypothetical, but our thought was that come 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, will have reached their termination, and whatever we've achieved will have been achieved and whatever hasn't been achieved. But my expectation would be that there'll be a new set of development goals of whatever nature. And I think we have an opportunity here by really pushing hard during this period of preparation and then initial years of implementation to actually ensure that the scaling agenda is explicitly part of this new development, the set of development goals, whatever they may be. I tried, and some of us tried with the SDGs, and I had to say that unfortunately the scaling agenda was not as explicitly reflected in the SDGs as I would have wished to see, but I think we have an opportunity here to work hard in making it happen in future. So as terms of outcomes, we have scaling to be mainstream in the majority funder organizations and will be default option for a range of domestic stakeholders in developing countries, and that scaling will be fully mainstreamed in the next Global Development Goals in the Development Effectiveness, not Defectiveness agenda. So that is the vision. I mentioned for stage one that we had some takeaways from the particularly from our sessions in this forum. So Gabi, could you please do next slide? And here, just for your interest, consideration, and maybe participation, and if, by the way, if you want to take a lead on any of these issues or any other issues, incidentally, in case you are interested, please do so. So we have a number of issues, and I'm not going to go into detail, but just let me briefly flag them. Implications of ADI for scaling, intermediation, scaling and systems change, more effective use of market mechanisms, sustainable use of blended capital, subsidies, and support for social enterprises, ethical considerations and scaling, and more effective use of evidence to guide scaling. One could say a lot about any of these items, but I think if you're interested, let's pursue it in the conversation or separately in future. Let me hand off to Larry. Larry, please.
Okay, just to say that there are a couple of really good comments in the chat box. I encourage more. I'm going to pick up on a couple before I go to this slide. One was the question of where do INGOs fit into this conversation? And I think that's a very good notion to explore further. Two of the case studies we did this year that Johannes referred to before were our INGOs, CARE and CRS. And it's been very interesting to us to see exactly how forward-leaning they have been in terms of trying to incorporate scaling. We think that is an important place for our community to make a contribution, namely thinking about exactly how implementing partners or INGOs more specifically can play the most positive and most substantial role in this that's consistent with what we were calling before transformative scaling. There was a second question about whether another area for exploration during the next year might be how to change project design to better incorporate from the outset scaling considerations. I think that's a really good idea, and we'll take that under advisement. Let me just now then turn to organizational models. We've kind of implied this, but I want to be very explicit about it. The original model that ran more or less from 2015 to 2019 was 100% voluntary, not a dollar moved. And we did that very deliberately because we didn't want there to be any perception that we were someone's project, that some donor owned this community of practice, that it was by virtue of underwriting it, basically shaped its agenda. We wanted it to be owned, operated, and guided by the members. And I think in hindsight, I'm very glad we did it exactly that way. MSI, because I was at the time the owner and president of MSI, I could do this without anybody else's approval. We kind of put it under our wing, but not so MSI would own it, simply so there would be a way to administer it. And MSI staff, like myself, was doing this on a voluntary basis. We had 6 working groups during those years. Each one had co-chairs. The groups had considerable independence then as now. Johannes and I were the co-chairs of the overall COP. Phase 2, which started in 2019, was when we recognized that the total lack of any financial resources into or out of the community of practice was definitely constraining what we could do. We could only do what somebody would volunteer to do. And so we decided to try to raise money for the administrative functions, and not for the technical functions, but for the administrative functions. And we did that, I have to say, very successfully. We got 13 sustaining members, each of whom agreed to give $15,000 a year in cash or in kind. We didn't care if they provided a service on behalf of the community of practice or provided money to the community of practice to run itself. We were simply trying to make sure that the things that did require an out-of-pocket expenditure had someone able and willing to pay for it. That worked, I would say, surprisingly well. It was an experiment. MSI continued to be the vehicle on this, providing some stuff pro bono, but getting compensated at this point for some other activities, the administrative support. We grew from 6 to 10 working groups, and we instituted something called an XCOM, which was made up of the co-chairs of all of the working groups, plus a representative from each of the sustaining members. So it ended up being 30 people more or less. That was the governing body for the community of practice, and which still allowed Johannes and myself to continue as SCOP co-chairs. That period, I would say, in some measure still exists, but we've now transitioned in 2004 to the beginning of what Johannes was beginning to imply in his comments previously, which is that we would still remain largely voluntary. However, rather than being freestanding or under MSI's wing, we'd embed within some kind of an NGO or do tank. There's several that we've been considering. We're happy for advice or input from any of you about other possibilities, but the idea is that there's an organization that would see the support of the community of practice as being consistent with their mission and would allow it to operate in the largely member-led way that it is today. We're optimistic that we can find that. We've got at least a couple of what we think are very strong candidates, but that's very much work in progress. We also think, given that Johannes and I are planning to take a step back around the end of this calendar year, that it's going to be important to have some paid professional staff in addition to the administrative support, and that means finding some money to pay for that. That also is a work in progress. In addition to the keeping the idea of sustaining members, we added the idea of core donors because we felt like it was going to take a little bit more money than we could otherwise generate to do some of the things that I've just mentioned. And so we have 2 of those core donors. With great gratitude, we say to the Eleanor Crook Foundation that's been with us from the beginning, and now the Hilton Foundation, each of whom are putting in somewhat larger resources over this year and perhaps next to help us over the hump on this. And as I said, where that involves transitioning from Johannes and myself doing our current roles to playing some ongoing role, but less directly trying to lead the community of practice, and therefore leaving some space for whoever and whatever comes next. As we've been saying throughout, this, like everything else, and maybe more than most things, really depends on what people want us to do, and people in this case are you. And so I'll go to the last slide and ask you to put forward any thoughts you have now. And this is kind of free form. We're probably not going to get to go through all of this in the 15 minutes we have left, but we want to have something to reflect on after the meeting also. So if you all, I'm going to be quiet for about 60 seconds to encourage people to do something. Go to the chat box, put anything you want. Put anything you'd like the COP to do, anything you'd like the COP to become, any role you yourself are willing or anxious to play in this, any ideas you have for us that you haven't already heard that you think might be worth doing. This is kind of free form, but it's our best way to get some input from you at this point in time as we try to figure out what the next steps for the community might be. So let me stop at this point. Please do put something in the chat, whatever it happens to be. We'll take a look at it in real time, but more probably we'll reflect on it afterwards and get back to you afterwards. So, Johannes, do you want to say something before I encourage them to do that?
I would just suggest, Larry, if anybody wants to put their hand up, and we have 15 minutes left in the session. We could have, also some personal interaction. I think that would be fine also.
I think that, no, I'm hoping for that, but I want to give people a chance for a second quietly to do something if they will.
Sure.
Okay, type something. Thanks, Leonard. Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Rita. And now I will transition to exactly what Johannes was encouraging. If any of you'd like to raise a hand and either comment on anything you've heard Johannes or myself say, or just take this in another direction, we'd be happy for that.
And including if you put stuff in the chat and would like to contribute that thought in person, that'd be also fine, because we really we're really happy for some personal interaction where we see faces or at least hear voices. So feel free to join in. By the way, if anybody has any comments on the sort of the longer term vision, and for example, linking the scaling agenda more explicitly to the SDG 2, 3 or whatever agenda and development effectiveness agenda, would be most welcome. as well as the sequencing. You know, we started with funders and we then want to move on to other stakeholders. So any guidance, any support, any ideas you have on that would be welcome.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you, Johannes. This has been a really fantastic conversation with you. Not only today, but I've been following these sessions for quite some time, and I think they are great. I work at WHO in the Department of Sexual Reproductive Health, where where I'm leading a project which is on scaling up interventions. So scaling up is really, really critical and important for us. And by scaling up these interventions for sexual reproductive health and family planning, we are also contributing to the SDGs, especially to the SDG 3, which is on health, and then to our goals of family planning and contraceptive services. We would really be happy to have these discussions further with you so that we could make it much more systematic than what we have. We have a plan. We're starting with some bottleneck analysis in different countries, and we have about 11 countries who have already started doing this so that we understand what are the factors which actually are preventing scaling up. We have done some systematic reviews, but we still think that there is still more to learn, especially from policymakers and other ministries of health and governments who actually do not publish, who do not write, but who have a wealth of information. Hence, we are conducting this bottleneck analysis work. And after that, we are going to do the development of strategies for scaling up. And we would really like to benefit more from you and your expertise so that we can do it better. We are also working with your colleague, Laura Giron, on this work. And well, it was great. It's great to hear the things you're saying. And I think, as I just mentioned in the chat also, scaling up again depends on the context. We think ministries of health should always be part of it, especially when we are starting with pilot projects. When these pilot projects are happening in countries and they're happening in isolations, they do not have a follow-up. So these are some of the learnings which we have done, which we think is something resonating with what you have also been, what are your lessons also. So very happy to hear and very happy to participate in further discussions with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rita. Just for your information and maybe other people, this year, the work that Johannes and Richard were leading that I've been helping with too on mainstreaming happened to have the good fortune of a cluster of organizations that work in the agriculture sector. So we're doing a bit of a deep dive into agriculture, but it's our aspiration to do exactly that with health during 2024. And so if that happens, and we hope it will, the stuff you're talking about will be particularly relevant in terms of where we see ourselves making a contribution, but hopefully where we can also take advantage of what you're already doing.
Yes, now I can come off mute.
There you are.
Yeah, so I don't know what just changed, but I can come off mute now. So Johannes and Larry, I had put a comment in the chat, really just thinking about when you all are engaging with donors and implementing partners, the extent to which the role is one of empowering them versus sort of a learning organization or even an evaluation type organization. And especially since you're pursuing this idea of like metrics, does that put you more into an evaluator role as opposed to like a empowerment type role?
Well, we might have different answers to that question, Johannes and myself, but I'll give you mine. I think we are not an evaluator. I think we're a combination of field building and nudge on this thing. And I think empower is closer to the concept than evaluator. The only sense in which evaluation for me figures into this is I think we owe it to ourselves and to everyone else to be as clear as possible about what it is we're encouraging people to do, so that we can help ourselves do it on this. Now, that includes having standards and it includes having some accountability for doing it. So I suppose you could call that evaluation, but I don't see us as somehow third party and outside the system. I see us as as at your shoulder, trying to help ourselves in many cases and help others if they're interested to move in that direction. Johannes, I don't know if you see it the same way.
Yeah, I think the underlying assumption and principle of our work on this mainstreaming with work with funder partners has been that we're not there to judge them and evaluate them, but we're actually generally with them, with their own staff, their own management, reviewing what they've been, the journey to scale and mainstreaming, and then coming up with ideas and suggestions for how they could further reinforce and strengthen their efforts, and of course extracting more generally lessons for the community practice and the development community more generally. So it's been very much informing, empowering, if you wish, and helping partner organizations to progress. Now, there's a separate track of work we've been doing in looking at evaluation methodologies that have been put forward by OECD DAC, that you're probably familiar with, for formal ex-post evaluation of development programs, and also evaluation guidelines and methodologies by mostly official funders who look at their own, for accountability and learning purposes, their own project performance and evaluate that. Now, what we found is that with a few exceptions, none of these evaluation methodologies focus on scaling. And one of the objectives currently and for the next year is to actually get these evaluation methodologies to include scaling more explicitly, not for us as a community of practice then to do the evaluations, but for the standard evaluation practice and the community of evaluators of development performance and practice to actually use what we would regard as appropriate evaluation tools that reflect the scaling dimension in an effective way. So I think our own work as a community of practice going forward should be to support and empower organizations, stakeholders, funders, and others to improve their own scaling performance as far as they can and want to. The evaluation community that's out there already doing evaluations, however, should also improve its practices to actually do their evaluations better.
I put a note in the chat in response to something that Nancy wrote, and I would absolutely implore anyone who has connections or ideas about this to reach out to me, which is this notion about foundations. I really do think that's a place we can make a dent. And within this little team of Richard, Johannes, and myself, I've undertaken to try to get the ball rolling on that. I have a few ideas, but I am definitely in an exploratory mode. If any of you are either from the foundation community or interested in foundations or just have ideas about this, please reach out to me personally on that, and I will be glad to include you in the conversation.
Larry, I think we're probably reaching the end of our tether today, since it's on my clock, it's 11:29. Shall we close and just say a few words in closing? Maybe.
I think we should. Why don't you go ahead and then I'll come after you.
So, well, first of all, great word, big word of thanks to everybody who joined today. Great comments in the chat. I haven't been able to read them all, but I will certainly do so. Just in terms of next steps, to repeat again that we'll pull together all the videos from the 12 sessions. We will put them on our website. We will also put together proceedings of summaries of each session and issue that in connection with our next newsletter. And by the way, while I'm talking about the next newsletter, you should be receiving in the next few days an email from Larry and me that requests your input into the next newsletter. Just to remind you that we ask all our members to share with the membership any news that you have in terms of your own work and your own engagement on scaling. And the more we get from you, the richer the newsletters are. They have been, by the way, extremely rich. And so any input, please respond, preferably within the time constraints that we'll offer you. Please respond to the request for inputs to the newsletter, because I think it's an opportunity to share your wealth of experience and your wealth of good practice in scaling. With that, let me thank again Larry, and let me thank again the MSI team that's been supporting us over the last 12 sessions. It's been a great experience, and I also want to thank all the participants of previous sessions, panelists, because it's been really a wonderful, rich experience. Over to you, Larry, and then we'll close.
Well, I absolutely agree with that, and I don't want to miss the chance, Johannes, to thank you for being such a wonderful partner in all this. It's been and continues to be a pleasure. We joke about each other and saying we can now finish each other's sentences, but the truth is that coming at it from such different backgrounds and such different perspectives has, at least for me, added a tremendous amount. And I feel the same way about so many of you who are coming in from yet different perspectives. It's the community at its best, and I hope you'll help us be even better. Thank you all very, very much, and stay tuned. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye, and thank you so much.